Every 3 years, this gospel story about Zacchaeus comes up in the lectionary, and every 3 years I think about Zacchaeus and I think about Warren Buffett and taxes and Jesus. Several years ago, I wrote a little article titled Warren Buffett, Taxes and Jesus. At the time, it was my modest theological response to the announcement that the third richest man in the world, the investment guru Warren Buffett, pledged to give 99% of his wealth to philanthropic purposes. And the political kicker of his message, that super rich Americans like him are not paying their fair share of taxes. So lucky you today that since I'm reminded of this, you get to be reminded of this with me this morning. Buffett specified then in the now famous New York Times article that his tax bill in 2010 was 17.4% of his taxable income, a rate lower than any of the other 20 people who at the time worked in his office. He concluded that it is time for his fellow mega-rich friends, as well as the United States government, to, what he said, get serious about shared sacrifice. Get serious about shared sacrifice, especially at a time when so many of their fellow citizens are truly suffering. Now, for our spiritual purposes today, I know that taxes and tithing are not the same thing. Obeying the law and sending a check to the IRS do not make taxpayers necessarily attuned to other people's suffering. But if we are to become serious about being conscious of the sorrows and misery of the poor and the working poor, it would do well to take personal initiative and interest about this. Charitable giving at its core fulfills the commandment of imitatio Dei, the imitation of God or following the ways of God. It's really interesting that even in this day and time, 55% of Americans say their giving is motivated by religious commitment. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say that's a pretty low number kind of given the last 40, 50 years of what we've seen happening in mainline Protestantism. And so with that, though, there is no mandatory obedience necessarily to our government, no matter how just or generous the actions may be, that can exempt us as followers of God in the way of Jesus from our higher calling to give because we get to and not because we have to. This being said, Jesus' friendship with a certain wealthy man makes me think that Jesus would think pretty fondly of Warren Buffett's message about shared sacrifice. I think this especially resonates with Calvary's own history of sacrificial giving that Mary Hulse preached about a few months ago. After all, a church isn't around for 135 years without there being much thought given to the economic sustainability of our mission and ministry. Today's gospel story gives us a different way of looking at wealth, you might say, as a means to serve people and make lives better. Now, it is true that Jesus befriended the poor and the sick and the sad and the despised. And it is true that sometimes his message would rub off on the well-off. And this is what happened with Zacchaeus. An entrepreneur and a high-powered tax agent, Zacchaeus had really made a name for himself as someone who was upwardly mobile. Not just as a tree climber, thank you very much, but apparently as a social and economic ladder climber too. You might remember that Jesus had once told a rich young politician that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom of God. Even against these unlikely odds, Zacchaeus, the coin collector, was ready for change of a different kind. He volunteers to Jesus, "I will give away half of my wealth, and if I am found guilty of fraud or extortion, I will use what's left to pay back the ones I've cheated on at, let's just say for fun, a 400% interest." Now, this is a major difference maker in Zacchaeus' life. To say that his outlook changed would be like saying that it's just no big deal that the Chicago Cubs are in the World Series for the first time in 71 years. I mean, it's a big deal. And that would be a major understatement. Some of you are wondering what the over-under is of how many times I'm going to mention the Chicago Cubs in this sermon today. I know it. But Zacchaeus' whole thinking changes. There is a whole reorientation about what is important about his work and his money and his sense of meaning and the way he would live out his purpose after he announces to Jesus his grand plan for change. This was a big deal for Zacchaeus, for someone who had made his living being a white-collar robber. Tax collectors took more money for themselves than what was required by Rome, typically. The system thrived on dishonesty, exploitation, overcharging, and other financial abuse that lined the pockets of these tax collectors. He was just one rotten scoundrel. But once he engages with Jesus, he is united in a new vision, and he is transformed from the inside out. As Anne wrote in her Weekly Word e-news article this week, she said this: "One of the reasons I love the title of Engage, Unite, Transform for Calvary's new action plan is that the words are just that, actions. And these action verbs, engage, unite, transform, are more inviting than they are demanding. They speak to our collective hopes and dreams for our church, but they also speak to the various ways we are individually gifted to connect with Calvary. Engage, unite, transform is also the theme of our fall stewardship series, and it invites us to take action. Now, perhaps not in a dramatic way that Zacchaeus did, or maybe, but certainly in ways that expand our vision for what is possible, both for our own personal lives and for this community that connects people like Rick and Farhan and Sandra and Marie and all the ones you have heard in these stories over the past couple of weeks in these videos. Calvary stories of engagement, of uniting, of transformation. And then biblical stories like Zacchaeus and our own stories do keep teaching us about why we do what we do and what it takes to sustain this life-giving work, what it takes to sustain the community that we have come to know and love here. As we consider our own commitments to Calvary's mission and ministry for 2017 over the next few weeks, and fully funding all of the vital ministries and missions that impact all of us. Again, Anne reminded me in her article this week, I'm just going to quote Anne through the sermon too and mention the Cubs and we'll go home. Just kidding. Anne reminded us in her article this week that because of you, Calvary, we are already a community of engagement, unity, and transformation. And your generosity of heart, time, spirit, mind, and finances make us who we are and who we have been for 135 years and who we will be together in 2017 and beyond. So again, to sustain a church for 135 years takes some planning and takes some commitment. It's a rare and beautiful thing. Social gospel prophet and Baptist Walter Rauschenbusch summed up the story of Zacchaeus like this: "Here a camel passed through the needle's eye, and Jesus stood and cheered." Back to the billionaire Buffett for a moment. He offers not exactly the same thing, but a kind of encore performance in that message he gave several years ago. He included two words at the heart of Jesus' mission, and those two words are shared sacrifice. Or again, as Mary put it to us recently, sacrificial giving. Calvary has a history of shared sacrifice and sacrificial giving. It's part of the legacy that we inherit as a community. Now, shared sacrifice are words often used to describe American military operations abroad, aren't they? But rarely are they used to describe our economic practices, whether in the United States or at home or in the church. And so I think people's ears kind of perk up when they hear the most successful investor in the world dare to preach an economic gospel of shared sacrifice through a fair share taxation system. And citizens of all political and theological stripes might do well to listen, as this has become fresh again in one way or another during this election cycle. But here's what I found more compelling about his message of shared sacrifice. Buffett's moral character makes capitalism and compassion seem not so contradictory. The thing is, capitalism without compassion helps pad our wallets, but it can insulate us from the needs of other people. Money can blind us to the needs of others, or money can bind us to the needs of others. As we have said in one way or another around here, it depends on whether we define sense in terms of coinage or sense in terms of core values, whether we spell it with just a C-E-N-T-S or whether we add the S-E-N-S-E to that too. Now, Buffett is a rich man with plenty of financial sense and plenty of common sense, in my opinion. And like Zacchaeus, his personal fortune does not isolate him from the misfortunes of others. And for Zacchaeus, his transformation is stunning. Jesus responded, "Today salvation has come to this house." Today salvation. I can't quote Jesus here without saying something about what sometimes is a kind of intimidating or confusing word, salvation. What does salvation mean anyway? Roger Haight, a Jesuit theologian at Union Seminary in New York, gives us a general definition that I have found really helpful over the years. He defines salvation this way: salvation may be understood as a condition of being united with God, and in and through God, of being united with other human beings, and at peace in one's existence. Now, this definition of salvation complements the Latin word salvus, which we get our word salvation. Salvus means heal and whole. And you can hear the word salve, like salve for a wound, in that definition. So to be united to God and to others is to be whole, salved. To experience oneness and wholeness is our way of being to coincide with God's way of being as seen in the life of Jesus. Now, whatever history you have with that word salvation, this is good news. What's not to want with this kind of salvation? Unity with God, unity through God with others, and peace in one's existence. Healing, wholeness. As a matter of fact, Jesus has a reputation for being a healer, especially in the Gospel of Luke, and it's easy to see why. Earlier in Luke's Gospel, the Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." And so if you believe St. Luke, salvation is an immediate reality embodied in real human lives. In other words, it's utterly practical, not always logically natural, but practical. And Zacchaeus is living proof. Notice that Zacchaeus didn't invite Jesus over to dinner. Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. Now, in some sense, Zacchaeus might not have had time for this kind of thing. He was an important man. His calendar was booked solid. And he's an utterly practical man. But before he knows it, he is raising a glass to toast his guest, and then his well-to-do first-century IRS agent says, "You know what? I give away half of my wealth, and if I am found guilty of fraud or extortion, I use what's left to pay back the ones I've cheated." Perhaps Jesus laughs at his use of the word if. Really, this is the godfather of defrauders. Even so, this is salvation, Jesus says. Today, salvation has come to this house, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. And here's where I might read between the lines a little bit, imagining this short, sleazy, snarky, smart, successful tax agent saying, wait a minute, maybe I've made a few financial mistakes, and I admit that maybe I've gotten carried away with taking advantage of my government position at times, but lost? Really? Aren't you being a little over the top? I mean, look at this crystal, these drapes. Look at my library. I mean, I have a house in the city and the country. Check out my tax return from last year. See if that looks lost to you. Whatever it was that Zacchaeus may have said, here Jesus goes again with his odd ideas about salvation and even odder ideas about who is lost. When someone asks you, how are you? What do you normally say? I'm doing fine. Have you ever let your guard down enough to just say, oh God, I feel so lost right now. I don't even know what to do. Let me ask too, are you in a place in your life where you just feel honest to God lost about one thing or another? Or have you ever been? Or do you know someone who is? A place in your life or theirs where there's just this sense of aimless, or a time when you felt that you were falling apart, or a time when the usual answers just didn't do anymore. Someone has described a 30-second television commercial as a mini drama of sin and salvation, peddling the latest products that can save us, showing us the happiness that comes with deliverance and what we must do to be saved and pay for it. Everything from Smirnoff to Starbucks, from Volkswagen to Viagra. Corporate logos are our sacred symbols that point us toward what can make us feel better and look better and live better, and what can restore what we sense is missing from our lives. We're all thinking, this can save me from anxiety. This will save me from depression. This will save me from loneliness. This will save me from myself. When we can say that we're honest to God, lost, and nothing is working to change it, we may be close to the salvation that Jesus talks about. Today's salvation, Luke says. A bishop of the early church, St. Cyprian, once said, there is no salvation outside the church. Now, if Cyprian puts it in startling theological terms, what if Luke's gospel is nudging us to claim and reclaim and proclaim there is no salvation outside the present? To put it in a Chicago Cubs kind of calculus, next year is this year. Yes, they're down 3-1. Thank you for the sign language out there. Next year is this year. That's kind of a message in Luke's gospel. There is no time like the present. And you can hear it in Jesus' words when he announced to the shocked, cynical, skeptical crowd of people who have just heard what Zacchaeus has pledged to do. Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. Today salvation, today healing, today wholeness, today unity with God and with the people he has ripped off. Today peace in his existence. Today there is no time like the present, even as we keep at least one eye on the future. Speaking of the present and the future, what better time is there than on our 135th anniversary that we will celebrate in just a few weeks to think about what makes who we are and why we do what we do matter? I've told you this before, but what first captured me about Calvary and what I love about these videos is hearing the raw, honest, thoughtful responses of people who have connected here and why that matters. One of the first things that I think about is this 6-word sermon, open to all, closed to none. And to me and many of us and all of us that have adopted this as a congregation, that's a big deal too. Open to all and closed to none. And now that welcome is a key part of our Engage, Unite, Transform action plan, Calvary Baptist Church of Denver is known as a Christian community of radical welcome in the Denver metro area. We are open to all, closed to none. Here's some of what I hear and see about that, and what we hear and see throughout the videos we've already heard and what we will hear. There are people within our walls because there are people out beyond these walls who are hungry for a message of belonging and acceptance and for the gospel to really be good news. There are people all over Denver who have never heard of Calvary Baptist Church who would love to find a place where they belong. There are people who feel empty and tired and uninspired who need a place where they can believe again, as Farhan mentioned in his story. To believe in God, to believe in themselves, to believe in the church, to believe that there is a future of hope and possibility. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Divorced men and women, with or without kids, people who have grown up in one religion or denomination but who are not inspired anymore, gay and lesbian individuals and families who want a place where they can be 100% who they are and grow and flourish in faith. People who will bring with them knowledge and light and passion and gifts. People who will be the future of Calvary, and the future is not 1 or 3 or 5 years away. The future is now. Next year is now. Today, salvation. The truth is, when we're being who we say we are, we can't help but want to give our time and our heart and our money to that. The question is, what sort of future do we want to create together? And our Engage, Unite, Transform action plan helps us begin to put that picture together, to take a photograph of the future. The God-sized dreams in that plan can only come true if we are living and serving for reasons other than our own benefits. God calls us to take a look at our own wealth even, just as Zacchaeus does, as Buffett has done, our wealth of resources and talents and gifts and assets, and figure out the best ways to make life better in the Spirit of Christ and in the name of Christ. A former Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, once wrote that the church is the only organization that exists for the sake of those who are not its members. I want to be part of a church like that. I want my children to be part of a church like that. And if the greedy green Zacchaeus is any example, then grace can enter into this quivering mass of contradictions that we call the self or life or the church, whether we feel lost or not. But into our lostness, into our loneliness, into our aimlessness, into our boredom, into our confusion. Finally, New Hampshire poet laureate Patricia Fargnoli captures this well, the sense of lostness, in her poem, The Undeniable Pressure of Existence. She writes, I saw the fox running by the side of the road, past the Sitco gas station, past the washomat, past the Thai garden, his sides heaving like bellows, and he kept running. I watched him, helpless to do anything to help him, certain he was beyond any aid, any desire to save him. And he ran loping on, far out of his element, sick, panting, starving, his eyes fixed on some point ahead of him, some possible salvation in all this hopelessness that only he could see. I don't know if you've ever been that fox running by the side of the road. If so, you're not alone. Sometimes you're that fox, sometimes I am that fox, sometimes the world is that fox. Jesus says the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. And I would add that Jesus did not come to found an institution. Jesus came to start a movement. In Calvary, you and I are part of that movement. So let's be a community that engages and unites and transforms. Let's keep being more of who we are, because those are powerful action verbs. And one more action verb that Ann offered us this week, give. To give of ourselves, of our time and talents, and of our finances. That's what being a church community means. Calvary is a congregation-supported church. And we can only serve God in our community and one another to the extent that those ministries of service are funded through our main operating ministry fund. There's no way around it. And what happens when we do? The kind of community we get to be and enjoy and share is one that offers, through the gift of God in Christ, some possible salvation in people's hopelessness. It makes Calvary's witness and work all the more important because this is a mission worth giving our lives toward. This is the sort of salvation not beyond the messiness of the human condition, but within it. Unity with God, unity through God with others, peace in one's existence, healing, wholeness. Today, salvation. Today, salvation. Next year is now. Today, salvation. This is good news whether you are a billionaire or a billionaire in Christ. And whatever our response, let it be cause for Jesus to stand up and cheer. Amen.